What's up, everybody? It is Tuesday, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I want to talk to you guys today about a very touchy subject, maybe for some folks. What we need to talk about today is meth. It's a sad subject, but we need to talk about meth. So bear with me just a moment, and let's do it. All right, when we were talking about meth, what I'm talking about is an alternative to the Rice method for caring for sports injuries, wilderness injuries, strains, sprains, stuff going on in your joints, all that good stuff. So the common train of thought out here is the Rice method: rest, ice, compression, and elevation. So several of you folks may know I've been dealing with an aggravated MCL in my right knee. Wear this fancy cool brace with the steel things in it. Not wearing it today. It's feeling a lot better, man. I've been able to stay off of it a couple of days after the small unit tactics class, so it's strengthening up. So I'm digging it, but I still got to be careful. But the RICE acronym, the rest, ice, compression, and elevation, is best used in the immediate time frame right after the injury to reduce swelling and to reduce inflammation. Once that has been achieved, there's information out there, studies out there that talk about the METH method. Now, this guy that come up with this, I think, is a Canadian dude, sports orthopedic, whatever. You can look it up. But METH, the guy could have come up with a better acronym, that's for sure. But METH stands for movement or mobilization, elevation, traction, and heat. Thought process behind that from what I research on it and what I know about dealing with my own knee right here is that the movement, mobility, you gradually work this thing slow and easy. Obviously, you don't stress it and strain it, but you got to start doing some sort of rehab on these soft tissues that are damaged, as long as they're not torn, beyond repair. Obviously, some things cannot be handled like this, but you got to have some movement, some mobilization. Elevation helps with the swelling, keep the dude elevated. Traction, the tissues inside of joints and things like that, elongate those, and it can it works it, but it's kind of like the traction and the mobilization is very similar here, but you're letting nutrients and fresh blood and things like that inside the joint itself. And then the heat, obviously, is heat. And you're just like with the Rice method with the ice, 15 to 20 minute cycles with a barrier between that and your skin. Same way with the heat and the METH. So 15, 20 minutes, apply some heat on it, mobilization and elevation and traction to go along with that. Try not to leave the injured area still for more than about a half hour, 45 minutes at a time, because it causes stiffness. And I've been dealing with that. Starts feeling good. I stay off of it, lay around for a day, it gets really stiff. So it's kind of one of those things where the more I'm exercising this thing, the stronger it's getting at this point. 2 weeks in, it ought to be. So just wanted to run this by you. A lot of folks may not have never heard of meth. You don't even need a glass pipe for this kind of meth. You can just do it. So there you go, man. If you're beyond the initial day or two or three maybe of the initial strain and you're using the Rice method, the rest, ice, compression, and elevation, don't be afraid to think outside the box. Switch it up and use meth. It's good.